Hey everybody, we're going to start in a couple of minutes. I notice it's really great seeing where everyone's from. While we're waiting to start, it might be also nice to hear if you use the raise hand function. I'd be really keen to hear of what your highlight's been so far of the festival, especially if you've been here from earlier on today. So if you go to the participants tab, Abe, okay, let's see. Julian, maybe you could unmute people who are raising their hands. I think we've got Lucy Green is the first one I see.
Yeah, I clicked ask to unmute, so.
Hey. Hi.
Cool.
Hey, Lucy.
Hi. The highlight of my day. I mean, it's been it's been an amazing day. It's been quite emotional for me, actually. The highlight of my day was with Tom, when I really felt that sense of connection with everybody. We're all dancing around and singing to the same tune, and getting into the vibe. And I think it resonated how actually the current crisis that has gone on and everything has really changed things. That people were connecting internationally and doing something so simple as tapping wooden spoons together. And I thought it was really fantastic, and they should do it again. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you. Yes, it's something really transformative about what he does, I think. Always puts a smile on my face. Yeah, so let's maybe get one more while we're waiting. Lisa Morosky, maybe Julian, you could ask Lisa to unmute herself.
Hi. What's really been wonderful for me so far has been finding such an incredible group of, I'm going to say like-minded people, but also unlike-minded people. I've felt kind of alone in many ways in, some of the thoughts I've had, and ended up in a breakout group with people who were like right on the same wavelength. I mean, the synchronicity was incredible, and I'm really happy to find so many potential conversants and dialogue mates.
Awesome, thank you, Lisa. So I'm going to hand over to David, who's going to be hosting this session that I know a lot of people, ourselves included, are very excited for, with Douglas Rushkoff and Jamie Wheal in conversation. Just briefly before then, we just did our very first unpanel with John Vervaeke and Nora Bateson, and so just in the spirit of iterative learning, when we do the unpanel, so Douglas and Jamie will ask a question to you guys, and then in meet.ps, we walk through the process of how to do that. I'll put the link in again. You go into ideas, you find the corresponding talk, and then you put your answer there. If we could just ask that when you put an answer in, if your answer is sort of a kind of brief one line, maybe try and avoid that and do a little bit more detail so that we can really see a sense of the kind of, a few lines, so there's a bit more detail. That would really be helpful. And also, if you could, even if you're not going to give an answer, it's really great if you can go in there and upvote answers that you think are particularly good, because as well as the answers themselves, the point of this is that we get a sense from the community as to, okay, what's really alive, what's really resonating. So be great if you could do both of those things. And that's about it. It worked really well. It was really a wonderful kind of way to flip things around. So really looking forward to doing it that way again. Let's just want to make it logistically as easy as possible. So with that said, David, I'm going to hand over to you.
Great, thank you, Ali. So yeah, this is, really looking forward to this conversation. I find it quite extraordinary that Douglas and Jamie haven't spoken before, certainly not recorded. I don't know if they had any secret chats in the last few days that they haven't told me about, but so I'm just going to do a very quick introduction. And as Ali said, the format of this will be Jamie will speak for about 10 minutes to introduce the topic. Then Douglas will speak for about 10 minutes to introduce the topic. Then we'll bring in the unpanel question that we've already worked on. And that will be an opportunity the unpanel question, that there'll be an opportunity for you guys to go away and work on an answer, which we'll bring in later on in the session after Douglas and Jamie have dialogued with each other for a bit. So yeah, there's so many similarities between Douglas and Jamie's work, and I'd say that they're two of the most interesting and significant cultural historians on the intersection of psychedelic culture, tech, and the mainstream culture at large. And Douglas Rushkoff, I'll introduce Jamie first, actually, and I'll come to, after Jamie, I'll introduce Douglas separately, even though I've written my notes in a different order. So Jamie is a longtime friend of the channel, and he's the author of I'd say the main guide, modern guide to transformational culture and flow, Stealing Fire, the creator of the Flow Genome Project. And I think we've done about 8 or 9 films, I think, with Jamie now, ranging from the pitfalls of psychedelic culture to sort of big transformative narratives. Like he's a real polymath thinker. And I really appreciate how he brings together this sort of really intellectual depth with an embodied transformational part with a real sense of integrity. And so Jamie, the topic here is building Team Human. And it's one thing to build Team Human when we've got a lot of things working for us. It's quite another thing now to be looking to build Team Human, or as you've talked about, homegrown humans, when it seems that everything is kind of falling apart at the same time. Would you like to frame how you see this?
Yeah. Pow. Nationwide. All right. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm happy to. And I think what I'd love to do is anticipating the conversation that we'll all get to have together after Doug has also jumped in, as we get to kind of frame this. I think the highest level question that we've kicked around together is like, how do we get to a place of heightened coherence and coordination? How are we at our best when everything around us appears to be at its worst? So that's the inquiry for our time together this afternoon or evening or wherever we are. But to kick it off, I wanted to actually read an excerpt from the introduction to the sequel to Stealing Fire, which I am writing right now, and it's called Recapture the Rapture. And the reason is because Doug has already had a direct influence on this. I remember I've been following Doug's work for probably 15 years or more. And if anybody's not already familiar with his stuff, I would put him on the short list of considered thinkers that are both participants in the emerging edge of culture and also have a rigorous scholarly and academic perspective on it, so that his parsing and framing of things is exquisite. And the bonus of following Doug and also Eric Davis, who has either already gone on or is about to, but either way, like I see them in a shared boat, which is they've given me about a sort of 5 to 10 year sneak peek as to what's coming around the bend. So when Doug published this piece a couple of years ago, it was so spot on with the work I was doing. I was like, oh, fucking hey, this is an awesome story. I have to retell it and put it in context with this bigger question. So I'm just going to read you guys a couple of pages from the introduction of this book that will be coming out next year. So in the summer of 2018, author Douglas Rushkoff, Throwing Rocks to the Google Bus, named one of the world's most influential intellectuals by MIT, wrote what amounted to an update on Evan Osnos's New Yorker essay from the year before. And in less than 18 months, we'd moved from the hypothetical to the nearly unthinkable. Rushkoff received an invitation to address a bunch of Wall Street financiers on the future of technology, a topic that he had spent his entire career tracking. And while he usually turned down those kinds of cushy speaking engagements, he was a founder of the cyberpunk movement back in the 90s after all, he admitted that it was by far the largest fee I had ever been offered for a talk, about half of my annual professor's salary. So he swallowed his disdain, did what most reasonable people would, and took the gig. Rushkoff showed up on the appointed day in what he assumed was the green room, the backstage place where speakers and hosts usually congregate during conferences. 5 impeccably dressed men sat down and introduced themselves. Slowly, Rushkoff realized this wasn't the green room, and there was no stage. There was no auditorium full of traders waiting to hear him talk either. These 5 men were his audience. At first, they asked him a few easy icebreaker questions. What was the deal with blockchain and cryptocurrencies? How far off did he think quantum computing was? Can Google really upload Ray Kurzweil's mind to the cloud? Alaska or New Zealand to escape global warming? But then came the real question, the one those 5 titans of Wall Street had paid north of $50,000 an hour to learn. How do I maintain authority over my security force after the event? That sentence requires some unpacking. Let's start at the end and work backwards. The event. That was their euphemism, Rushkoff explains, for the environmental collapse, social unrest, nuclear explosion, unstoppable virus, or Mr. Robot hack that takes everything down. By this point, discussing, debating, or wondering about future scenarios had given way for these men to a chillingly simple placeholder, needing no modifiers or further explanation, simply the event. And while these men may not have been willing to bet on which particular domino would fall first and spark a chain reaction, that they would all topple soon after seemed self-evident in their analysis, a fixed constant in a more complex equation they were still trying to solve. Next, the verb, maintain authority, carries the distinct implication that A, authority might be challenged or questioned in the near future, and B, that those 5 men had it and intended to hold on to it. Finally, the object of that action, the noun, my security force. Not my personal assistant, not even my body man, butler, or team. My security force, unvarnished, plural even without an S. And judging by the urgency of their $64,000 question on how to control that group after the event, possibly mercenary. For the remainder of their allotted hour together, those hedge fund managers laid down a few more of their cards to Rushkoff. How would they pay their paramilitary if the economic system collapsed and paper and digital currency became worthless? How would they prevent a Lord of the Flies style coup once things went pear-shaped? Would secret combination locks on food supplies work? How about shock collars or AI robots? That's when it hit me, Rushkoff said. At least as far as these gentlemen were concerned, this was a talk about the future of technology. Taking their cue from Elon Musk colonizing Mars, Peter Thiel reversing the aging process, or Ray Kurzweil uploading his mind into a supercomputer, they were preparing for a digital future that had a whole lot less to do with making the world a better place than it did with transcending the human condition altogether and insulating themselves from a very real and present danger of climate change, rising sea levels, mass migrations, global pandemics, nativist panic, and resource depletion. For them, the future of technology is really about just one thing: escape. To his credit, Rushkoff challenged their assumptions. In response to their blunt questions, he answered that the best way to maintain the loyalty of their private security force was to start treating them really well, like family, starting now, and to not stop there. Echoing PayPal founder Max Levchin, he suggested they do the same in all their current businesses on this side of the event. The more effectively they could do that, he suggested, the greater the odds we could all keep the wheels on civilization in the first place. They were amused by my optimism, but they didn't really buy it, Rushkoff admits. They were not interested in how to avoid a calamity. They're convinced we are too far gone. For all their wealth and power, they don't believe they can affect the future. They are simply accepting the darkest of all scenarios and then bringing whatever money and technology they can employ to insulate themselves, especially if they can't get a seat on the rocket to Mars. The result will be less a continuation of the human diaspora than a lifeboat for the elite. Rapturists, every last one of them. So while it's tempting to marginalize those who embrace rapture ideologies, to think they only show up preaching fire and brimstone or wired up to suicide vests, the stark reality is they're all around us, wearing black mock turtlenecks and fleece vests, chatting on iPhones, speaking at TED and Davos, tuning into doomsday preppers on cable TV. So A, huge hat tip, Doug. Awesome. And thank you. And B, I just want to kind of conclude this with the definitions. I think we all need to become end times literate. So to do that, I want to kind of introduce and define 3 key terms that typically get mumbled and jumbled and lumped together, which is the rapture, Armageddon, and the apocalypse. So I just mentioned rapture ideologies there, and I want to define how the working lens that I've been using for that, which is that rapture ideologies, again, whether it's traditional and fundamentalist or whether it's techno-utopian, share actually under the hood 4 unifying characteristics. It's that the world is fucked. There's an inflection point coming soon. Me and mine come up roses on the other side of that inflection point. Therefore, let's pin it and get there as fast as possible and never mind the collateral damage. Now, the problem with rapture ideologies is, as you can imagine, is they're all 1%er solutions, right? And whether that's the morally virtuous or the saved, whether that's the billionaires with the ticket to ride, whatever the grouping is, right? It omits and excludes 99% of us. So the question here is how, as the world is being hijacked, and this is Yeats 101, right, from the Second Coming, the best lack all conviction, he wrote, while the worst are filled with passionate intensity. So how do we recapture the narrative around the rapture? And how do we insist on all of us or none of us solutions? Because no matter how tempting a rapture ideology may be, and it could be blockchain, it could be psychedelic renaissance, right? You name it, we are susceptible to them all. And John Gray at the London School of Economics has made a powerful case. So there's a book, Black Mass and the Death of Utopia, where he argues that all of these, including communism, including all of these things, are alpha and omega Judeo-Christian exit strategies. So how do we make a deep and profound commitment, all of us or none of us, and recapture both the uppercase rapture, right, the end of time, and also our lowercase rapture, right, our passionate conviction. So that's the first thing. We need to recapture the rapture. But the next is the apocalypse, right? And I think I already heard this in Jordan and Nora and John's talk this morning, which is, apocalypticus from the Greek literally means the revealing or the unveiling. So while we want to reclaim the rapture and say, not so fast, 1%ers, right? Those are all sociopathic solutions to a collective problem. We need to actually accelerate and bring about the apocalypse, the unveiling, so that we can see clearly, right? And the final one is Armageddon. Armageddon is actually the end time battle. This is Sauron and Mordor. This is the battle of 5 armies. This is where it all goes down. So the question here is, how can we recapture the rapture? How can we hasten the apocalypse? And how can we forestall Armageddon for as long as possible? And I would propose that the solution is the thing we're here to talk about today, which is all of us coming together in a vitalized, connected, courageous team human. So with that, Doug would love to pass it on over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. That was you've done my job for me of a wonderful introduction to Doug already. I will recap a little bit of what you so beautifully laid out, Jamie. Douglas As Jamie said, you've been named as one of the top 10 most influential intellectuals by MIT. You're the author of many books, including Future Thought, Shock, and Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. You coined terms like viral media. And your most recent book, Teen Human, was a real, you described it as a mic drop moment of how do we recapture these human values from the big tech companies, having sort of tracked them from the early kind of utopian Silicon Valley days into a quite sort of what we might call a dystopian present. And I've only met you a few times, Doug, but I've really appreciated you're a real ambassador for Team Human with your authenticity and earnestness of inquiry. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you and Jamie in dialogue with each other. Would you like to do your quick intro and then we'll get into the unpanel question? You do need to be unmuted. Doug, you're muted.
Do that.
You can actually unmute yourself, Doug.
There you go.
All right. I've unmuted myself. I feel the same, but it's okay. Yeah, I mean, lately I've been questioning my own identity as a so-called progressive and the whole notion of progress. I mean, in some ways it might be Jewish guilt talking, but the Judeo-Christian tradition was to really take a circular civilization and make it linear. You know, with the invention of text, we had the ability to write history and the ability to write contracts into the future. And it was a beautiful thing. And we decided once we could write things down, the first thing we did was we wrote down the law. We wrote down ethics. We thought we would use writing to make this year better than last year and next year better than this year. And we moved from a circular understanding of the world, an indigenous understanding of the world as a series of cycles to we're going to actually get somewhere. You know, the Jews, we're going to bring on Moshiach. You know, there is a God, one God, probably a guy up there somewhere. And yes, God is all powerful. And the reason why the world isn't perfect yet is because there's this thing called linear time. And once the story unfolds, we'll get to that perfect moment. So let's all keep working. Eyes on the prize, you know, pedal to the metal, ends justifies the means, arm in arm, we're going to vanquish everyone who resists us until we get to that promised wonderful place. And you know, that's what got us in this mess. You know, that's what got us into the industrial age and now into what I've been calling digital industrialism, that we're applying digital technology to this scaled industrial age, exponential, market-based, you know, universal solution. And where I get concerned is when those of us who see the fallacy of that approach, when we adopt some of the same language. How are we going to unite as a planet, all the people, and figure to take down global capitalism? You know, how are we going to create the scaled golem to fight the institutional evil out there, so that we look for scaled universal solutions to these scaled universal problems, when I'm coming to believe that the answer is not scaled universal global solutions at all, but extremely particular local, highly individual and distributed solutions. That the response to globalism is not a universal revolution, but a highly local thing. You know, anything universal, as far as I'm concerned, anything universal is highly abstracted and divorced from on the ground reality. And the kinds of solutions we need are going to be real tiny ones that we probably get no credit for, ones that, you know, there's not going to be a book title. It's a different approach. It's not saying everything is fine the way it is. I'm not saying that. There's a lot of problems in the world, but the way out is not necessarily by erecting something equal and opposite to the problem that we're seeing. Now, I was watching television last night, the police strategy in Minneapolis versus the police strategies in Atlanta. In Atlanta, they had all the fires going off, and the police were making ancient Greek phalanx formations to hold the line. And in Minneapolis, the police and National Guard, they just vanished. They were nowhere. And eventually it's like the people were marching, and eventually it was like, how could you have anything but a peaceful protest when there's no resistance to you, when they left? And on a certain level, not that we can ignore oppression, no, we can't, but I'm thinking the way we take back reality is by taking back the land and our time and our power and our value and our exchange. We very locally and interpersonally. The one regret I have in calling Team Human is that the most common email I get is, how do I join? How do I join Team Human? And I'm like, dude, it's almost always a guy, dude, you're already on Team Human. You're one of us. I was like, well, where do I go then? How do I, and I go, you go to your own town, your own school board, your own land zoning commission, your own, the way to do this is going to be scaled to the human body, not to the abstract universal organization or institution that we long for to fight this battle for us. It sounds like a cop-out, but it's actually harder to do, moment to moment, eyeball to eyeball, choice to choice, in your community. And I think that those they won't scale up as such, but they will ripple. They will create a different experience of reality for so many of us. The problem with the billionaires was, and I wrote about it in that piece too, was that what they're trying to do is to earn enough money to insulate themselves from the reality they're creating by earning money in that way. They're trying to build a car that drives fast enough that they can escape from their own exhaust. And what they've realized is it's impossible, that they're coming for us, that I can't insulate anymore, that this is going to blow. So they're looking for, the bomb shelter. It doesn't work. And I'm looking toward the opposite. How can we individually, moment by moment, small choice by small choice, make the world a place that we don't need to insulate ourselves from it, that we don't need to look towards this future day when everything will be okay, to decide, right, this is fucking it right now. We're living it. There's nowhere to go. So what do you do then? What do you do if this is really it? All you can do is change your behavior, your approaches to the way things are. And for me, that's become the solution. I'm kind of going offline in some ways. That's why I call Team Human a mic drop. It's kind of like done. I've said more than anybody should be allowed to say in one lifetime. So move on and just be a nice person now.
Thanks, Douglas. Well, I hope we get at least another hour out of you before you decide to drop the mic for good. So I'm going to ask Ali to come in and explain the unpanel again. And I'm going to drop, so Douglas and Jamie have been working on a question. I'm going to drop that into the chat now. Ali, do you want to say what the format will be?
So the question will be in the chat. It will also be in Meet PS, which I think everyone is familiar with because it's where the links came from to join this. So the way it works with the unpanel is, so the question is in there already, and David's going to drop it in the chat as well. I'm just going to briefly share my screen to give a sense of where you go. So you go to, can everyone see that? Just give a little thumbs up if you can, David. Yeah, Jamie, great. Those people I can see. So you'll see here, here's the question. How did we learn to play well together, et cetera, et cetera. You click on it. And then when you're in here, you vote on it, but you're giving an answer, right? So I think we should. And so the point here is not to give like a one-line answer, just to give it a little bit of thought, because there are going to be a lot of answers. And ideally, we're going to have a few of them upvoted, right? So if you are feeling like you want to kind of sit back and you're not really in the mood to give an answer, please do just jump on here and upvote answers you think are really valuable, because that gives us a sense of what's valued in the community, and that'll help us give the best answers. And that creates a better, better outcome overall. So that's pretty much it. Just as a reminder, it's the ideas section of meet.ps. That's what's going to be where you put your answers. And then we're going to look through these and then choose some of the answers that are voted up the most. And then you will have the chance, if you are that person, to ask your question to Jamie, or sorry, to Kit. It's so flipped around that I keep getting it wrong. I did in the last session. To give your answer, not ask your question, to give your answer to Jamie and Douglas, and then create a dialogue like that, and we'll see where it goes. We might also open it up to Q&A a little bit later, but I will stop sharing. And I think in the meantime, I think David might have a few questions for Douglas and Jamie, just to give them a chance to chat a little bit while everyone and anyone who wants to has time to go in and give an answer or vote answers they think are relevant. Cool.
Yeah, I don't have any prepared questions. I was knowing Jamie and Douglas were coming in with so much firepower themselves, I was going to ask them to maybe choose something to riff off on what they just heard from the other.
Yeah, certainly happy to, and already just seeing the chat. I mean, this is a high quality bunch of people, a bunch of humans gathered together to already be riffing. I mean, the caliber of this versus YouTube comments is exponential. So that's fantastic.
This is being streamed live to YouTube, so we've just insulted half the audience.
I mean, haters gonna hate. You know, troll's gonna troll. So for me to unpack that question, and by the way, Doug, I share it. I mean, this morning I woke up with a heavy heart and I'm like, oh man, what's the fucking point? You know, like what on earth can we possibly say that can begin to wrap our heads around any of this stark raving dumpster fire of a world? And clever thinky thoughts are clearly insufficient. So just to fully emphasize that whole, I mean, it's a total hackneyed cliche of the think globally, act locally. But the flip side of it is it's actually highly pragmatic, because if we lose basic food security, physical security, connectivity with our neighbors, all these kinds of things, we just go down through Maslow's, floorboards. And the most aspirational goals for collective coherence, or whatever you want to call it, simply is just an elective option we don't get to play. And so the idea of sort of dusting off community and communal support and resiliency and self-responsibility does feel an essential part, because like we can't control it all. We can't make sure of governance and politics and macroeconomics and multinational corporations. We can't turn all that on a dime. But unless we look after ourselves and get sorted there first, at the personal, at the familial, and at the community level, then we don't stand a chance of playing any of the other games. So I did see somebody in there saying, as Doug, you were commenting, of like, oh, this sounds like Jordan Peterson's Clean Your Room, but just with a more liberal bent. And I would actually say sort of kind of, but it's not about personal morality in this case. It's about connectivity, viability, and anti-fragility. And those things, I would just say, hey, absolutely, let's get on that, because we are atomized, fractured, like hyper-individualist consumer zoo monkeys right now. And we want to break out of that and get back to like homegrown human, team human requires responsible, self-reliant folks to make it up.
Right. I mean, things can grow by distributing outward and laterally rather than coming up with a great new top-down solution. Where the thing that always gets me most nervous when I'm with a group of great activists is when they're saying, okay, how do we get people to anything? It's like, once you're trying to get people to do something, then we're back, figuring out how to do propaganda or social control of one sort or another. And it's like, and how dare I be the one who wants to get someone else to do something else? It's what I'm looking at now is whether or not sort of the rapture that you're describing, or the the apocalypse without the Armageddon, whether that can be a gentle unfolding of what is here rather than a reaching towards. We don't reach or strive towards apocalypse. We, when you think about, the Buddha or anybody who reaches some kind of awakening, it's like, oh, it's not, it's not this very Western quest for, if we could only get there. And the other thing I'm wondering is, has our job changed from, this is a very a silly way of thinking about it, but or egotistical maybe, but has our job changed from like saving the world to doing palliative care? And what would the difference look like? To help everybody contend with the probable end of our civilization is, we go through a mourning period and a slow. How can we be kindest about it? How can we have the least amount of pain going into the destruction of the civilization and hopefully its replacement with something else? Or are we trying to keep this thing? Is it about keeping this thing going? And then what's the difference between what those even look like? So I'm almost wondering, like, is giving up really such a problem? If giving up just means, okay, we're all going to die, but let's be as nice to each other. Let's make it as painless as possible. Let's, help people experience as much meaning and connection, and, and then maybe we'll surprise ourselves and not die after all.
Yeah, and you're kind of, you're nudging into like Jem Bendell territory and right, and everything from deep adaptation to Dark Mountain to all this kind of stuff.
Right.
I wrestle with that. Personally, I think I am still nonetheless like irreducibly some form of like rage against the dying of the light. like if I'm going to choose, I'm either going to go down surfing or go down swinging.
Right.
It's one or the other. So I guess a maybe a both end, we'll see.
Right.
Really where I'm hanging all my hope at this point is not in the passivity of palliative care, right? But is in the agency of realizing the time for cherished outcomes has passed.
Right.
That, and St. Paul 101, like that it's time to set aside childish things. And now, and I've riffed on this with David in the past, but like the notion of what Martin Luther King called soul force, what Gandhi called satyagraha, like that asymmetrical amplifier of human courage, right, which sends shockwaves through time and space and history. If we can normally it's been 1, it's been 10 people, it might have even been the nominal 300 of Leonidas and the Spartans, right? But it's always been tiny pockets of that, and it has shaped the course of civilization. So can we get to that? And that is the reconciliation of the paradox of like, we're stuffed and there's no way out. So let's make art, right? Let's sing our war song or our love song. And that's the band plays on the Titanic, right? We know those those 4 bastards, right? And they're like, women and children first, captain goes down with his ship. This doesn't end well for me personally. However, therefore I am free to do the only thing that is mine and cannot be taken away, which is make art. And that redemptive capacity, that's the one I'm all on black. That is my last bet and hope and ways to do it, right? The idea of radically initiating ourselves and each other into, and someone else in the chat said, what about that Kairos Chronos thing that Jordan was riffing on? Like, we're big on that. And that idea of like, if we can come to a Gnostic embodied initiatory knowing of the nature of things, right? And at the same time, not piece out of Chronos, of clock time, and be fully embodied here. What transformative potential might that hold for us? So that's the one that at least loosely gets me out of bed in the morning. Some days are harder than others, but it's the one I keep coming back to,
Yeah, and that's, and it's holding on to the paradoxical nature of human existence. It's not a circle or a line, it's both. It's not male or female, it's both. It's not progress or stasis, it's both. It's not Kairos or Chronos. again, it's both, but both in balance somehow, and that's it's tough. It's a tough one. And right now, the most of the critique that I get is from people who believe that we're already so far gone that the only way out is through. So the topsoil will never be replenished. What do we think? There's 30 harvests left or something in global topsoil, unless there was some radical transformation in our permaculture approaches. And they'll say to that, well, that's the reason we need Monsanto all the more. Pedal to the metal. We've got to, develop more technologies, more industry, more capitalism, and more growth is the only way, to keep this thing going. And
I hadn't heard that cheery fact. Thanks, Doug.
Yeah. Oh, anytime.
30 harvests. All right, nice. Just add that one to the list. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, 30 years is so far. That's so far in the future. No. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we are. I think we can continue happily exploring this. Just want to check in with David and Ali. How's the questioning going? If there's a bit more,
we were going to give you a few more minutes and then come to. We've got a list of questions, answers coming up. But if you guys want to riff for another 5-10, and then we'll.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to John Gray, the fellow I mentioned, who was who was cautioning against the perils of utopian thinking of any stripe, right? And his, he made that great observation that even communism is still Christianity with a different Judeo-Christian alpha omega with a different skin. You just strip out the sky god, but you have the proletariat living in sin, and then the inflection point and happily ever afters. And those happily ever after stories are so A, seductive, and B, pernicious. Because the moment the ends is literally heaven on earth, then the means are always justified to get here. And that's how you get Che Guevara turning from, sexy motorbiking doctor guy to like cold-blooded killer, right? And like that, we've seen that movie. And so one of the things he introduced a term I hadn't even heard of before, which was agonistic liberalism, right? In the true sort of post-enlightenment sense. And the idea of like, we're not ever going to get to singing Kumbaya out of a single hymn book, nor should we even try. That's part of the problem. The idea of agonistic liberalism is we want to preserve the capacity for the back and forth, for the vigorous debate between true, again, enlightenment liberalism and conservatism, and then throw in any other hism schisms. And the idea that what we're fighting for is not our preferred outcome or our vision of utopia. What we're fighting for is basically the infinite game and the ability for us all to keep playing it for as long as possible, as generatively as possible, to include as many people as possible. And that honestly does feel at risk right now. It feels like on both sides of the political spectrum, you've got the boogaloo folks. I don't know if anybody's tracking this, but like the far alt-right who are literally egging on civil war, like they're banking on a second civil war. Like those are Death Eaters. Let's just smash this whole fucking thing to the ground. And you have in the most extreme aspects of the left, let's dismantle Western civilization and patriarchy. So on both sides of the political spectrum, you have folks advocating for the first time in a century, the finite game winning and blowing up the infinite game of the Enlightenment experiment. So for any of us that are agnostic and or humanistic, I think that's the meta conflict that we're looking at culturally right now. And the weird thing is, as all of these eschaton-like things do, is they make strange bedfellows. And the fact of like the most militant SJW is actually on the same team as the 4chan troll incel. And you're like, wait a second, how is this happening? And there's that idea that we're sort of entering the intertwingularity, not the singularity. And as we go down the drain pipe of Kairos, right, and Chronos, like everybody's mythologies, is this the Matrix, is the Star Wars, is the evil empire the good guys, or is that the next 2020 election campaign? Like, I can't tell. And I can't tell whether I'm reading Revelation or I'm reading ISIS's Endgame or I'm reading Hollywood and sci-fi. And it's going to make really strange bedfellows.
Yeah, it's interesting. The decline of the Star Wars franchise really, it tracks what you're talking about. When George Lucas was doing Star Wars, he really meant, you don't really know, is the Jedi knighthood corrupt? Are they the bad guys, as he was trying to say in the second three movies? Maybe who really is good? What if Luke had joined with his father to run the universe? Could they have yin-yanged it together? You know, there were the questions. Now, I mean, all Star Wars, there's just bad guys, right? The bad guys that you kill with ray guns. So they really did, they lost it. The question is whether the Enlightenment experiment, maybe this is just history, is whether the Enlightenment experiment was just so flawed that it was based in the kind of reductionist empirical logic of folks like Francis Bacon, that it was so much about these kind of Platonic ideals. It was so separate from women and people of color and the ground that you know, that it was incapable, you know, that it just moved to the other stuff you're talking about. It moved to Hegel and Marx and Heidegger and all that stuff. It became so idealized and disconnected from just what real experience is. You know, it feels, I mean, not to say that the people trying to help to save the world are the problem, but in some ways we are. You know, I mean, it's just, we're trying to save it in a way that makes people happy, as opposed to save it in a way that all Black people are gone or all women are slaves or whatever these other visions of reality are. But, you know, I'm trying to kind of unwind from, you know, my own projection of how I want things to be. You know, and it's a lot of what you were talking about, a lot of what you were criticizing before reminded me of when I used to speak with Terence McKenna. And I would get really mad at him because I would say, look, you're acting like only people who have had the DMT experience are going to make it through the bottleneck at the end of time. You know, so you better hop on board and have that so you know how to. And I'm like, no, it's not going to work. George Bush has to come with us. It's like all or none. We're one organism. And he's like, I'm sorry, Douglas, but it's just not going to work that way. You know, and so we, our side, such as we are, the brilliant, well-meaning counterculture can become just as guilty, like you say, of the exclusionary thinking. I guess where I'm stuck is, and maybe it's a fine place to be, but it's almost like how do you sit with this? You know, this is a hard moment to sit, you know, without feeling like, should we be in the streets? Should we be shouting a name? What project? Should I be developing an alternative currency? Should I be, you know, volunteering at school? And then there's only so much one person can do. So do you just do the thing? Do you just, you know, yeah. It's a tough moment for that.
Well, I mean, that I think is actually, this all builds beautifully, right? Because that notion, and again, this is a hypothesis that I'm offering. I'm not asserting this is our shared consensus. But if we entertain the idea that actually cherished outcomes and preferred utopian destinations are actually structurally part of the problem. So we actually want to commit to some version of agonistic liberalism and the capacity for us to expand and extend the infinite game for all of us, including my sworn enemies. Right? The whole, I'll detest what you say, but defend to the death your right to say it. Like that general jam. Right? If we're committing to that, then the other element is letting 1,000 fires burn. Like, what is the psycho-spiritual or sort of neuroanthropological, however you want to frame it, equivalent to blockchain? Because what ought we do? There is no singular answer there. And Jordan and I have actually had this conversation in the midst of the COVID thing, because we got sucked into that, Daniel, Jordan, and I, on like a whole bunch of team human projects, like very specific, like PPEs and epidemiological research. And like, it was grinding us into the dirt. And I was like, wait a sec. I was like, I'm an able-bodied, semi-capable human, but I don't think this is mine to do. And Jordan, in classic Jordan form, was like, yeah, this is, you know, instead of talking about Dharma, right, or some esoteric concept, he's like, he goes, the work ahead is impossibly dense and complex and will not be sufficiently able to be solved by any amount of metabolic effort. Therefore, you should choose what is your Thor's hammer. And like Thor, right, only like it is infinitely dense and infinitely heavy and impossible to move unless you're fucking Thor. So like that invitation for us is let 1,000 fires burn and find your fucking hammer. Because there is something in this world that only you can do, and you need to get clear on it and do it. And then let us crowdsource the wisdom and the innovation and the solutions. And some will be metasystemic, and some will be grassroots local. Some will just be loving and raising a child or tending a patch in your garden. Like there will be a billion, there will be 8 billion or even 50 billion innovations and solutions, and 99% of them will snuff it. But among them, somewhere, the flame will persist and will catch and will kindle. And that arguably is the best of kind of the free market ethos, which is we've never really got to try. The same way Nietzsche said there was only one Christian and they nailed him to a tree. We've never, like free the market of economics, free the market of ideas, of innovation, of entrepreneurship, and of, future-proofing. But let us all get on it.
Right. I mean, and once you free the market, that's when the monopolies crumble and you get the distributed, local, bottom up, everybody, not everybody necessarily doing their own thing, but you scale solutions appropriately to where they are rather than force them. And it's also important. I mean, I think for a lot of us who are trying to improve things is to realize that sometimes small victories are the best ones. I feel like so many young people are worried about, well, then how do I get more followers? How do I get more likes on that? How do I grow this thing? How do I, rather than just doing something, they want to create the website that aggregates all the people who are then doing that thing, or the website that aggregates the websites that are aggregating. Everyone wants to, become the thing. And I understand if you don't have the million people on Twitter saying, yeah, it feels like it hasn't happened, but that's such a silly road to go down. It's so much easier to find gratification and to see the results of what you're doing when it's the smile on the kid that you've taught to read, or the land that you've replenished. It's so much. There's so much real work to be done that these sort of abstracted solutions are. I mean, that's why it's tricky for us as two accomplished white male intellectuals with published books and all to say, oh, don't don't stand in front of crowds with your solution. I mean, it's part of why I've been feeling hypocritical lately as whatever this is, public intellectual. It's part of why I want to just like be a teacher and help people locally. It's not to say I'm done, but it's like, there's enough other ideas and other people. So I just want to somehow stay in service rather than in whatever the opposite is.
Yeah.
Great. So we're going to throw in the first answer from the unpanel, but if you could do another Terence McKenna impression at some point during the rest of the talk, Douglas, I think everyone would appreciate that. That went down really well.
That high-pitched psychedelic whine. Yeah, it's awesome.
So Ali, I think the first question is Rain Revere.
That's correct. Yeah. So I think Julian is going to unmute Rain.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. I responded to the question that was posed by bringing up death and our relationship with death, and really our relationship with mortality. What are resource constraints if we're not playing the immortality game anymore?
You mean if we don't want to live forever?
Yeah, I think the question is how much are those game theoretic competitive aspects of society that we're seeing part of this conscious and unconscious drive for immortality? And how important is a relationship with death and mortality to be able to widen and not be seeking that end game?
Yeah, I'd say absolutely non-negotiably essential. So like, I don't think we actually get to soul force until you've met your maker, until you've actually reconciled with dying. And I share this quote all the time because it literally guides my life at this point, but it's Wendell Berry, and he uses that phrase, practice resurrection. So the idea of like, in sports science, there's the notion of like the last mile problem or conundrum, which is how marathoners will run clockwork 5-minute miles, and then they'll get inside the stadium and see the finish tape, and their final mile, they'll suddenly run a sub 5-minute mile, even though they're exhausted. And you're like, what the hell is that? And what it is consistently is some neurophysiological and psychological buffer in our system that says, don't spend it all. You will die. And once we know we are safe, then we have extra. We have this reserve tank. It's the same way when if you try and hold your breath underwater and you think you have to breathe, you're actually only at about 40% of your maximum breath hold. But all of the safety buffers are like, mayday, mayday, get a gulp or you're going to drown. So by some form, by hook or crook, right? Either life and hard knocks or initiatory deliberate practice, like cultivate death practices such that, like the samurai idea of like meditate 1,000 ways to die. So when you're on the battlefield, you are undivided in your attention. Like it feels like we have to have already reconciled with our mortality to be able to source and offer from love in a truly like exponentially transformative way. So absolutely, Rain. I mean, I think that's the non-negotiable one. And we are absolutely a death-phobic culture. We ship our elders off to be cared for at minimum wage by strangers and our elders are on drugged up, and we poke and prod each other with botulism, toxin, and fillers to pretend we're not aging. So like, yes, like 100% bring dying back and make it a central part of our orientation to how we live.
Yeah, I mean, I got to deal with death a lot just from people I know, dying and being with them and thinking about it. And then, Timothy Leary tried to do a kind of a design for dying around his death. And interestingly, he kind of abandoned that trip as it got close to the end and it got really serious. He was like, oh, fuck this. I got to really deal with dying here. And it was interesting to see, the show is over. I can't do death as a show. I'm not going to freeze my brain. I'm not doing this. I'm going to deal with dying. And I feel okay about dying, but then, I mean, what I've been concerned about is the death of our civilization or the death of our species or the death of life itself, and trying to apply the same understandings of resurrection to that, or return, or the eternal return to civilization. And then I interviewed James Lovelock a few months ago, who's 100 years old, the Gaia hypothesis guy. And he said, well, because the sun is so much hotter now than it was when life started on Earth back when, if we reached a tipping point and it got too hot for life on Earth and life on Earth died, we no longer have the conditions for life to start again. That he believes that the maintenance of the appropriate temperature for biology as we know it to exist on this planet it's a delicate system, and it's in danger. So then I started to think about, well, what if everything dies, right? What if life on Earth dies, and what if it turns out that this was the only life in the universe, and it turns out that the only life in the universe was the universe's only bit of self-awareness? So what if it's really dying? And how does one come to terms with that? And it's just so, for me, it's so hopelessly linear. It's so different from the sustainable circular reincarnation, imitation of the gods sort of myth of eternal return that indigenous people had, and that I'm trying to kind of adopt myself as a little Western linear person. But I feel like even if we are going to go on and it is going to be okay, we've got to even as a society, as a civilization, we've got to accept that possibility as well. Accept that yes, I'm playing the infinite game, but infinity might not be mine. We might not. It's you play it and keep it going as long as we can. Keep that that hacky sack up in the air as long as we can as a species. But also accept that if we are temporary, what is that then? And what does that mean for our I've been reading Levinas lately. He's a really interesting guy. And he basically says that all we've really got is our comportment. is how you comport yourself is really all that you can know. How do you engage with the other, and how do you expand? You know, Timothy Leary was the one who had the quote, "Find the others," but he meant find the other cool psychedelic people. And then when I've retrieved find the others, I mean find the others, find, you know, the MAGA hat wearing scary people that you don't really think you like, and find the human in them. And then I just met an indigenous man who was like, no, the others are the other species. It's not the other, that you've got way more, you've got everything in common with that Trump supporter. You think you're different from him? It's like, start recognizing the others that you're trampling on. So yeah, I'm playing with that too, but just expanding our notions of self and supposed other play into these real misperceptions and fear of death. Which I totally agree. It's essential. I mean, Becker was writing about it, and really he nailed it, right? And now so much of everything we do, all those billionaires we were talking about, they're just scared to die. They're really just scared to die, and they do so much. You know, you're absolutely right. And when you're not, because the fact is, all that gamification, you know, as they showed when they tried to recreate the prisoner's dilemma experiments, they never work. They never work. People never behave that way. They never do the thing that who was it? What was his name? The game theorist, the schizophrenic who
John Nash.
Yeah, John Nash, who came up with him, and later he said, "Look, I was a paranoid schizophrenic coming up with these ideas. This is not the normal human response." But when you are afraid, I mean, it's certainly in the big picture. When we're afraid of death, sure, we're gonna gather. We're not gonna trust that the manna is coming from heaven the next day, and you know, you get worms.
Yeah, I love the prisoner's dilemma. I think the only people that did the prisoner's dilemma in that way were economists, because they'd been taught that that's what they were supposed to have done.
Right.
So next up is Gordon Young. You had an answer to the question. Gordon Young?
Yep. Okay, there we are.
Great.
Unmuted now, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I threw out the common aphorism that just in response to the basic framing of the question. The problem posed by the question is, how do we deal with limited resources or resource constraints? And the issue with that, or one way around it, is recognition that the best things in life aren't things. Right? That once we get past a certain level of resource, that the things that we value, we're valuing them for the ability to make our lives better, but not necessarily by making our lives better in a material sense. And so, in some ways, it was an easy answer, you know, a banal answer to the question. But I think the part that merits a lot of contemplation is, how do you awaken that recognition for people, especially in this culture that we're, you know, in our Western culture. But I don't think it's our Western industrial information culture. I think it's I think there's a lot of sort of genetic evolutionary bias towards individual trying to get more, right? How much money is enough? Well, just a little bit more was John D. Rockefeller's answer, right? Or how much, you know, how do you know you're wealthy enough? Well, when I can afford better toys than my brother-in-law, right? Well, there's some pretty innate forces that drive us towards this material grasping. So the question I think that's really interesting is, how do we awaken that recognition individually for ourselves and for the people around us and the culture and the, you know, 7.5 billion of us that are on this planet. I think you know, the event is coming unless we do awaken this kind of recognition. And so I think that's where's the growing edge, how to propagate that understanding that there's more to life than just the material. I don't have any answers for it, but that's why I'm here, is to talk about it with other people. So hope that sparks some other interesting conversation.
Nice. Nice. Yeah. And I mean, you know, that's the kind of, those are the shallow waters we're all run aground in the kind of personal growth and transformation space, right? Because people are like, oh wait, I'm grinding and I'm chasing material stuff, and then I listen to Eckhart Tolle or whatever. I drop acid or go to Burning Man, and I'm like, hey, we're all one. It's groovy, and I'm gonna hold this as long as I possibly can until wham, 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 and now I'm pulled down again to my material seeking, striving animal self. And my sense is that if we want something to work, we have to fully acknowledge the better angels of our nature, but also the baser animal. And we actually have to meet both, because you can't just go fucking cross-eyed and pretend. You know, hypothermics don't make good poets, right? I mean, there's just basic hierarchy of evolutionary biology, encoding, competition, et cetera. And so my sense would be is that because the question that we've posed, which is how do we play well together when the stakes are high and there's a ton of attempts or efforts for us to gel together and do this hard thing. And we fragment, it feels to me, at the top, and we fragment at the bottom. So we fragment with the large number of people that try to come together on behalf of a bigger cause. And there needs to be some basic version of, hey, I mean, UBI is a contemporary expression of it, but basically we find a way to meet everybody's basic needs so that striving for competition and advancement and one up, one down relationships is at least hypothetically off the table. Now, there's the multipolar trap in game theory, which is if someone's going to rush to break the pact, then it might as well be me, right? And then you get shitty sociopathic behavior again, simply without even having to have a sociopath in the mix. It's just, I suspect someone else might be. Therefore, I will act to protect my own interests. So I remember in grad school reading a case study of the 19th century range wars in northern New Mexico. And it was this fascinating story. If you guys don't, this is when the cowboys were like fencing everything. And it was basically a pitched battle between the Hispanic sheep herding communities and the Anglo cattle companies, right? And it was, you know, and the cattle companies were going around and killing all the Hispanic folks and fencing everything for their cattle. Super bloody, crazy conflict. But what was fascinating is that in the Hispanic mountain communities where there was limited resources, this was high alpine, not super lush, kind of sketchy, was that within those villages, there was explicit social shaming against individually taking more than your fair share. So there was like if one goat herder started basically trashing the commons in order to asymmetrically gather capital, right, in the form of a bigger flock or whatever, they were actually socially shunned and shamed. That would be the kind of thing their mother would take them aside. Don't be an asshat. What are you doing, right? Or their friends would maybe distance them or tease them or something along those lines. And so some version of a UBI, and this could be in an intentional community, this could be in an urban environment, this all the way to a nation state, but some form of that, and then some form of healthy pro-social shaming, which is different than guilt. And I know there's different and conflicting definitions of this term, but the idea of like guilt is unhealthy. That's me, I'm not worthy. But shame is I have transgressed the highest norms of my society, of my in-group, and I am responsible for atoning for them. And if we have that at the base layer, is there a chance for us to, you know, to basically re-normalize the commons and pro-social behavior? So I'll leave it at that. There's also a tops-down element, which is how do you take the most awake, charismatic transmission folks, and how do you get them to play well together, which is another nut to crack, but we can come back to it if it pops up.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, and as you know, until now, most of the social shaming is being done by the wicked on the good, to make us, shameful about, sex or gender or whatever, that we carry around shame. And the truly shameless people, the people who do the shameful stuff are shameless, right now. They don't seem to care. But I agree, my work has always been about trying to reveal the underlying operating systems that people accept as given conditions of nature, but are actually inventions. So central currency, everybody thinks, okay, money. So how are we going to get more money to more people and this? And it's like, and some of us are challenged. Well, what is money? What kind of money are we using? What are the rules of this money compared to a let system or time dollars or something that doesn't have interest and have to grow? And, what if we created money that was optimized for the velocity of currency rather than the extraction of capital? And what would that look like? And you go back and you start reading the moral philosophers like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, and you see that they were actually thinking the way we are, even though they've become the patron saints of the economist and neoliberalism. They no more believed in that than Darwin believed in competition as the only path of evolution. So I'm feeling like the path is the retrieval of really largely medieval economic mechanisms, the commons and market monies and local currencies, and let people experiment with those in their small local ways, and then hopefully see them expand out. I mean, subsidiarity is the answer to the last two questions in some ways. Subsidiarity was a sort of an economic principle that said no business should grow larger than it needs to in order to conduct its business. You don't grow for growth's sake. Joe makes his pizzeria, it serves his community, and the next town gets its own pizzeria. And that's actually more resilient, because then if he runs out of dough, he can call Mary in the next town and say, "You've got extra dough. I'm running out here." It's not his pizzeria anymore. So these models exist. It's just right now, when I talk to, suppose people in power, I guess, or people who seem to be able to implement some of them on larger scales, they really don't believe they're possible. They're so, the laws of scarcity-based central currency, profit, capital, economics are so embedded. They haven't read their history. They don't even know that these things are possible. UBI works out mathematically. It just doesn't work in their understanding of how money works.
So we've got maybe time for one or two more, but Dave Pendle, could we get your answer to the question?
Yeah. I was sensing, or I've had an experience of a collective awakening that is enlightenment beyond the individual. So it seems to be, if there's a deep recognition, an embodied recognition of interdependence on others and the system and the earth, that seems to be a way to shift consciousness away from purely preoccupation with survival. That's my contribution for the moment.
I'd buy that. I mean, you're not alone, is the way I've been trying to tell it to people. You're not alone. Being human is a team sport, and it's so much easier when you do that. But people are still, I don't know when, I'm not a psychologist, but there's this terrible twos phase, where the baby realizes it's really separate from its mother and has the ability to say no, and it experiences itself or himself, herself as a distinct, and it's an important stage for the baby to go through as distinct. Then, certainly by the time they're adolescent, then they want to reconnect with all those, and become one with all these other people. And I feel like our civilization's gotten stuck in that cult of individuality, that we only feel, truly alive or truly flourishing if we are, somehow manifesting individually. And it's a shame. It's a shame, but maybe that's breaking down. Maybe we're going to reach that adolescent stage and start to realize that there's the potential for party here. That's part of what, the beauty of what even at Burning Man, even at, whatever gathering, whatever weird psychedelic, rave that you're at, however commercial and however silly, and even if Eric Schmidt comes, it doesn't mean that there's not the possibility for that waking up, that, oh my God, it's so much more fun with other people. And once you get there, at least you're starting on the way. Poor Maslow, putting self-actualization at the top of the pyramid, it created a detour for a lot of us into this idea of self-improvement and this whole self-help movement. And you go to Esalen and sit in your little thing and manifest as yourself. There's such a it just dovetailed so easily with the me generation and consumerism and personal empowerment and then the cosmists and life extension and my life extension, not of our planet, but life extension of me. And I'm going to upload my brain to that computer. And that's our side getting a little silly about this stuff too. But yeah, I totally agree. Once you break down the barrier and realize you're not alone in this trip, that you've been connected to all these other people the whole time, it becomes, I think, a little bit easier to manifest in some of the ways that we're suggesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And then for anybody that isn't already familiar with Scott Barry Kaufman's work, he was a protege of Seligman at Penn. He's now at Columbia. I think he's a buddy, and he just published a book called Transcend, which is about Maslow's unpublished lost papers and the fact that the cherry on top of the pyramid was not actualization, it was transformation, meaning in Maslow's terms, service, selfless. So the fact that we spent 30 or 40 years and the entire boomer generation went barking off, to narcissistic self-indulgence is one thing. And then Dave, to your point, I mean, yes, wouldn't it be nice? Beach Boys, right? I mean, if we all found that we had unity consciousness and we were connected to source, right? And we could all manifest from there. Yes. But then the next crux is who the fuck grabs the one ring of power? Because like it's magic and it's potent. And then so let's just telescope ahead. Okay, yes, that's possible. It's reproducible, it's scalable, and a shit pile of people are doing it all at once right now. And how do we learn to play together once people are actually tapping in to the mainframe? And because Lord Acton 101, absolute power corrupts, right? So the notion, so when I posited that bottoms up, like UBI plus healthy social shame as a way for us to manage the excess grasping of game theory drivers and the positioning and the jockeying. And someone in the comments had mentioned, in addition to that, Hispanic sheep herding, social norm, there's also particularly in the Pacific Northwest tribes, the notion of the potlatch, which is that when I accumulate wealth, I actually accrue status not by holding it and hoarding it like the dragon Smaug, right? But actually by gifting it and putting the velocity of wealth back into my society. So it's almost sort of like an indigenous version of Metcalfe's law. Like I actually gain power within the network, right? By redistributing and reallocating resources versus hoarding. So that's super neat. But the tops down one is as or more problematic, which is, a conversation I think we've all been having in this, on Rebel Wisdom and elsewhere, which is why is it that people that are sourcing from that place tend, as a rule, not to play well with others?
Yeah.
And how the hell do we actually bond this together? And one of it feels like, because up until now, the waking up process or the actualizing process has been largely individual and catch as catch can. So we're all like apex predators, like panthers, and we all need 400 square miles of territory. And you try and put, you put a dozen panthers in a pen together and it's a shit show, versus if you guys saw that documentary Blackfish, right, about orcapods, like they've got bigger brains than we do, and that all the extra folds are for social coherence. So they literally have anatomically, they are hardwired they are apex predators too. The wolves of the sea, they're badasses, but they have figured out how to play this game. And so for me, that's the true missing link. And I mean, lots of efforts in the last 5 years of coming together with smart, brilliant intention, like Dharma holders or whatever, they've all got their superpower, and the superheroes cannot get it fucking done. And so one proposed solution would be the idea of like, can we see each other's light from each other's light, right? Without getting pushed away from each other by seeing each other's shadow or fallibility or humanity. And so if you find, as a thought experiment, like who's your 12? Like find your dozen and think about the people that are closest in your life and think about the beautiful, perfect part of them that is their expression. It could be they're always the humorous one, they're always the adventuresome one, they're always the emotionally intelligent one. This is the creative, harebrained idea when like, I love you fully and wholly for that. In that expression, when you're on that, you are perfect. Right? And that's awesome because we can love each other up. But then there's also the element of, well, hey, rather than some of us getting kind of sort of most of the way there, and whether it's pressure from the marketplace or Instagram or whatever, we start fronting that we're all the way there. We actually say, what if we assemble from this dozen that is our karass, right? As Vonnegut would call it, right? Our crew. That we say, we take your slice of the divine, we take your slice of the divine, this your slice, and we assemble Voltron. We assemble perfected human. That is the sum total and mediated by all of our relationships, which is we express via agape, like I fucking love you because I see the perfected in you, but none of us grab the ring. That's a non-starter. But between us, we can hold and metabolize perfected human, and we can transfer all worship, right, sacrifice, dedication, loyalty to that hologram that is the one, right, held and metabolized by the 12. And can we use that as a way to precipitate what Teilhard de Chardin called the omega point, like the body of Christ, de Chardin said, is the second coming at the end of time that is all of us as omegans.
Right. I don't go to Omega, but it's nice. It's nice. I mean, I guess I don't believe the ring actually has power.
That was super Woody Allen of you right there, by the way.
Okay, good. I tried. It's better than Terrence in some ways. It's closer to my origins. But the ring, I look at the ring as social construction. You know, again, from Torah, it's like Samuel goes to God and says, everybody wants a king. They want a king. Everyone else has a king. Now the Jews, the Israelites, they want a king. What do I do? And God's like, no, we don't do kings. That's not what we do, because it's about power and all. You know, we don't do that. And Samuel's like, look, they're not gonna behave. They really want a king. And God says, all right, pick the tallest guy. Pick the tallest guy. As if it's just like, it doesn't just pick some dude. You know, at that point it was all dudes. You know, you should have picked a woman. But pick the tallest one, put the crown on so they know it's the king. The whole idea is the crown. To me, the crown is about the opposite of power. That the crown is saying the only reason why this person gets to be king is because they're wearing the crown. It's a total social construction. We're going to pretend like this guy is something when he's actually not, in order to just administrate what we're doing. And we've fallen into the trap of feeling like our kings are actually powerful, that they've got something where, you know, I prefer almost the kind of the revelation in Eyes Wide Shut, when Sidney Pollack basically reveals, as the head of the big secret great Illuminati cabal, that he's just an administrator. You know, it's just something we got to do every year. It's just, you know, that's all they are. They're just administrators. But anyway, it was just because when you were talking about the ring, I wonder, but we can empower it. Certainly, if we focus on that power, we can invest power in it. I believe in magic. I mean, I think it'll go there. But if we started to see leadership as a social construction, it'd be so much easier to deal with.
Yeah, well, and you've hinted at it several times today, Doug. You've mentioned most often a guy when you're kind of talking about the old Judeo-Christian story, and you're like, often dudes here doing this and that and the other, and it should have been a woman. So in another like bit of culture architecture, it feels like a really healthy thing, in addition to the basic needs met and potentially pro-social shaming and built-in mechanisms for redistribution of excess resources and all the kind of potlatch notion. Another potential is literally like the grandmother's council, right? Because, you know, Jared Diamond writes about this, like menopause is very rare in nature and is actually an adaptive trait, and even in the primates broadly. And it's one of the more unique things, including mating outside of estrus and this kind of stuff, that humans have. And the adaptive reasoning is that, hey, grandmothers actually provide evolutionary advantage by bestowing wisdom and helping raise the tribe. And the idea that because they're no longer in the procreation game, which is arguably the root game theory play, because they're outside of that, they have the capacity to hold wisdom for the collective in a way that virtually no one else does. And so, you know, the Iroquois Council had that. They had that sitting above the war chieftains, and the war chieftains would have to go to the grandmother's council and be like, can we go whack those dudes? And they'd be like, you could, but if you lose any of our boys, you're gonna have to go back, and now we're in a blood feud, and like, don't fuck it up. So rather than like attrition and this kind of stuff, they had to be seamless. So like men, I would submit, are really good at three things. We're good at fighting stuff, fucking stuff, and building stuff. But why to fight and who to fuck and what to build, we're terrible at. And so anchoring that counterbalance, right, with a council of grandmothers feels like it could be a you know, a relatively shorter path to a bunch of solves.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, just a bit less than 10 minutes left. So I was going to give Douglas and Jamie the opportunity, if there's something that you haven't, a question you haven't asked or something you wanted to say. I'd like to throw something in, and you can take this or you can go with something different. Just that with both of your work, the similarity, you've both kind of looked at transformational culture, psychedelic culture as potentially having a lot of the answers, like as a source of hope for culture. And you've both, to some degree, I think, come out in a less hopeful place. I'm interested. Do you still have hope for that? Those tools, that part of culture, or not? Where have you ended up?
I mean, I have hope. In some ways, I think I have more real hope than I did before. I just don't have climactic hope. You know, I don't have big hope. I don't have spectacle hope. I've got, you know, I've got small h hope, you know, which is in some ways, it's, I mean, I used to believe with Terence that, you know, we're doing something that, or you know, Desjardins, that humanity is evolving to the next phase. And just as water boils and reaches complexity, that humanity is moving to the next fractal level of awareness. The collective holographic mind is about to be realized, and the internet is the trial run, and psychedelics are the lubricant. And now, you know, you will, as Terence used to say, you will literally be able to see what I mean. And that was the way he talked about it, that we'd go like squid into a virtual psychedelic virtual reality collective thing. And as an adolescent or a young man, I was like, yeah, you know, let's go there. Let's reach it. Let's find it. And I was always a little questioning, even in the first book, Siberia. I'm like, is this the philosopher's stone, or is the philosopher merely stoned? You know, and I would even back then, in my most idealistic, I was open to are they right? Are you serious? Really, you know, the friggin', you know, Andy Warhol of the 21st century, or is this just a bunch of people stoned? What's going on? And I find myself in some ways almost less cynical than I was then, because I'm no longer evaluating whether humanity is about to rise from the chrysalis of matter into pure consciousness before the weight of capitalism takes us down. And I'm much more interested in, you know, these tiny relationships between people. And maybe it's fantasy or maybe it's not, but this sense that when I make genuine eye contact and establish rapport with just one other person, that is trickling out, whether it's quantum or God or something else, that is my whole universe at that moment. And it's not nothing. It's not white privilege. It's not a psychedelic fantasy. It's real, and it's happening in my path, you know, and that if that doesn't, that may scale better than the whatever 40,000 copies of some book that I've written and have traveled around. You know, that it's fine, write the book and it's fine and it's entertainment. I just don't know if the knowledge production and sort of industrial age spread of all this stuff is really more meaningful than that tiny.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think we're very much exploring same things about sort of, you know, is it a wave, is it a particle, is it a hockey stick redemption curve, or is it an endless cycle of life, right?
It's a great way to say it. Yeah.
A polychronic quantum epistemology holds all of them and says, hey, reality collapses based on the lens you lay over it. And I think there's my strong hunch right now is that, yes, there is that hockey stick curve, but if you zoom, and it feels like we're accelerating right up the knee of it to some omega point, but we'll get there and realize you zoom out, you realize, oh, this was actually just an arc. This was just a piece of what is in fact a full circle.
Right.
And it's a full circle on civilizational rise and fall, like Ozymandias 101, look upon my works, ye mighty, or Charlton Heston in the Planet of the Apes with, you know, the Statue of Liberty buried up to its, you know, buried in sand. Like we will realize, hey man, bigger civilizations, more complex shit has come and gone, both on this little blue marble and off it. And we are all just wheels within wheels. And at the same time, the transformational point, that omega point, I do still feel is there too, which is not that we get to peace out and it's the rapture escape, but that we actually get to become twice born. So to Rain, to your question about death and mortality, like when we die to ourselves and our preferences, you know, and our stories in this life and still in this body, and we get to be twice born, right? As a homegrown human on Team Human, then we realize we come back all the way to exactly what you were talking about, Doug, which is the fucking here and now. My family, this rocking chair, that garden, right? And the hope you have that phrase, right? That whenever there'd be the blowhard dude sitting around the kiva, you know, some grandmother would be like, yeah, but does it grow corn? And so we can come home full circle like Dorothy, having gone on that heroic transformative path to realize with fresh eyes and for the first time, there is no place like home. And this is it. And this is everything. So that the starlight and the transcendence is perpetual and timeless. It's opposable thumbs and 8 or 9 decades to do this human thing that is the embodied miracle, and both worth fighting for passionately, right? And allowing to be what it must. Like where Castaneda like talks about with Don Juan, he says, you know, he says the warrior's task is to do what he must, knowing it is futile, and to do it anyway. His is the act of controlled folly. And once we've swallowed that one, then it's all fun and it's all art.
Awesome. Fantastic wrap up from you both. Thank you so much for that really free ranging conversation and for bringing it back down to earth at the end. And it was back down to earth and it was cosmic at the same time. So thank you. And for the second Terence impression as well, Douglas.
You asked, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm just about to, can we say thank you to Jamie and Douglas?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. It was harder for them than for us. Thank you.
We won't unmute everyone now, but just we'll do a visual clap for Douglas and Jamie. Thank you. So I'm just about to hand back to Ali for 15 minutes segue into, we have Tim Booth coming up next. So Tim Booth is the lead singer of the band James. And I did an interview with him that I haven't managed to get out yet. We're still getting it through music clearance to get it onto Rebel Wisdom. But a really fantastic interview about his spiritual practice and how that kind of really influenced the music that he put out 20 years ago. And he's a proper kind of superstar musician who's agreed to do an hour-long session for us of music and movement from 10 o'clock. So don't go away. That's going to be a real high point in about 15 minutes time. So Ali, awesome. Do you want to tell us what we're doing for the next 15 minutes?
Yeah, I've got 15 minutes of very bad amateur beat poetry, which I'm going to go through. No, I thought it'd be nice in these last 15 minutes to, for us all, as many of us as possible, to just reflect on the day. And I'll just recap. I think we've been on for about seven or so, maybe slightly more than 7 hours. And we started off framing the day. We had that initial panel exploring the 3 tracks: meaning, sense making, imagine futures. Then we broke off into different rooms, and everyone will have had a different experience. Maybe some of you spent the entire time. I think there were about 300 people in Nora's warm data lab. All the other rooms were pretty packed. So there was a lot that happened. And then we came back, we did the unpanels with Nora and John, and then obviously just now with Jamie and Douglas. So it's been a really full day. And I thought, yeah, my reflection on it, well, I think David and I'll just give a couple of minutes and then we'll open it out to anyone who wants to just reflect on their highlights of the day, or perhaps something that was unexpected or kind of has stuck with them or that they're still wrestling with. Can really be anything. But mine is certainly to actually to just to bring in another Terence McKenna quote, the sense that I've heard a few times from people about the value of finding the others, which is something Terence McKenna talked about a lot, actually, is finding the other people who are interested in the same things that we might be interested in, especially if it might go against the cultural grain in some way. And I know that for me, it's really nourishing to find that and have new conversations with people. The other thing that's really stuck out for me today, which is, sorry if I'm repeating it, I said it, I think, in the last session with John and Nora, was the sense that it's right now, and maybe this is always the case, but it certainly feels to me right now that it's how we approach things rather than what we do that matters. It's how we do things. So in a time of great uncertainty, it's very unclear what we should do. And we've had a lot of people on the channel talking about the danger of jumping too quickly into action. And so the process of just, I think, for me personally, moving back away from this doing mode into more of a being mode and thinking, who do I want to be in relation to my environment? Not what should I do about it, but what kind of person do I want to be? How do I want to think? Not what should I think? And how do I want to go about creating action rather than, what should I do? Those feel very important to me. And I've heard that come up a few times today. And that feels very, that feels like something that's really stuck with me. So we'll open it out in a moment. But David, what are some of your reflections on today?
Unmute myself. There we go. Excellent. Yeah, I'm just really touched, and I'm glad. I think I'm touched and surprised by how readily people throw themselves into these experiences when they're provided. And I just love the sort of, if you build it, they will come nature of how this is panning out so far. And I'm really touched by some of the comments that I see in the chat about people wanting to know how they can keep in touch and whether there's something that can kind of come out of this as an experience. And that's what I'm kind of feeling now, is like, and everyone's saying, we can't lose the chat. We've got to keep the chat. We've got to keep it somewhere so that we don't lose this. It's sort of like trying to hold on to a moment, which we will do. We'll find a way to make the chat available. I think most likely it will be, because all of this material that we're keeping, we'll put onto the members area of the website. So I think we'll turn it into a Google Doc and make it available or something. So yeah, I'm just feeling that sense of, I'm touched. I'm feeling touched by that. And I'm also, as Rebel Wisdom is pretty much just me and Ali most of the time. So everything that we've been putting together is basically in our hands. Ali has basically put the whole festival together himself. So that's kind of, so it's difficult for us. We're very aware that there is we are wanting to catalyze something bigger than ourselves, and we're not entirely sure how to do it. So that's what I'd like to say, is we're open to suggestions. We're really wanting to know how it's possible to catalyze more than, because we are the kind of we are the bottleneck in the operation, as well as the connective tissue. We're also the bottleneck. I'm kind of very aware of that. So that's the inquiry for me. It's like, how do we kind of catalyze, scale, move into getting out of our own way? And so that's my inquiry, because I feel the level of enthusiasm, and I feel the level of expertise and insight and all of these things in the chat and in the community, the wider community. So that's the question for me, and I don't know what that is. Tomorrow, Peter Lindbergh and I will be doing an open session around this topic of sense making. Like, what does sense making look like, and how might it be possible for Rebel Wisdom to scale up to being more of a platform, more of a publisher, rather than me having to film and edit every single thing that goes out on the media channel. And so there's this sense that for me is the inquiry that I'm open to. And I think this is a really valuable, like, having created this festival, this space for us all to kind of come together and to connect. Like, how do we turn this into something more than just a one-off event where we come together, but we start to kind of build something a little bit more decentralized and walk the talk.
Yeah, and I think perfect time to reduce ourselves as bottleneck and just open up in the next sort of 7 minutes. It'd be really nice to hear from anyone who wants to, just by using the raise hand function. I think any reflections you have on the day. I'd also like to give a special shout out, because I saw so much in the chat about the Council of Grandmothers. So if you are a grandmother, please do raise your hand, because it'd be great to hear from you, especially after all that. I think, with 600 odd people, that might be the case, and we'd like to hear from the Council of Grandmothers as well as everyone else. So why don't we go for Keith first, because I think you had your hand up first. Keith Runyon, I'm going to unmute you.
Are you a grandmother, Keith?
Yeah, Keith.
Not a grandmother. And if any grandmothers want to pop in, I want to welcome that. But I want to thank both you and Ali so much, David. And it was really a lot of my undercurrent message that's kind of been carrying with me throughout the day has been that process orientation that Ali, you spoke about. And also this just feeling deeply moved by the depth of intent in this community. And one of the main takeaways that I wanted to kind of reflect, I think that in engaging with these sort of visionary circles that I think Rebel Wisdom can be a part of, that's been very much oriented towards, I think, trying to transcend the culture wars. There's also a way that can create separation from, from the culture itself, right? And I think in some ways I see that translating into this individual message about nothing about us without us, right? Where it's like we are coming up with visions for the whole world, but are we really incorporating that full message? Are we incorporating the global South, all of these sorts of things in our transcendence of the culture wars? So I think that is a really, really important point. I want to see more networking on that. And then the second thing is trying to tap into what Jamie and Jordan and Daniel are doing, whatever kind of collective intelligence is forming there. And I would really like to see, I'm building a community garden in Santa Cruz, but trying to create real embodied places for communitas among people who are having this conversation, get that really occurring so that we can have strategic position and kind of position of satyagraha with Kronos and Kairos as that unfolds, and really be ready to be oriented towards helping the whole when the next wave of coronavirus or post-coronavirus occurs, and trying to make the world a better place. So thank you everybody so much.
Thanks, Keith. In the hunt for a grandmother, I have no idea if this is the case, but it seems to be a woman's name. I'm going to go for Deirdre, because you had your hand up next for that. I'm going to unmute you.
Hello.
Hey, Deirdre.
So when I was listening to the idea of scaling up, really, it could be more of an idea of scaling down to local levels, to finding wisdom leaders in local communities. And for years, I participated here in women's circles, and there's, the concept of the millionth circle, where there's, circles upon circles upon circles that then finally tip over to a new way of being. And so just tapping into those. And I've really just enjoyed the whole concept of, thank you so much for the concept of everything being circular and then text moving us into this linear place of there's going to be some glory at the end. That was just amazing, because I study goddess, and I'm an interfaith minister, and I also do disability rights for people in our local community. And it was just, and the inclusion of this group, I even just heard, so, you know, the last speaker just say, nothing about us without us, which is our mantra in the disability community. So that was helpful. Yeah, it was just a great day. Thank you all.
Thank you, Deirdre. And Kimberly, I think we have time for maybe one more, maybe two, but Kimberly Lathrop, you are unmuted.
Thank you. And just, this has been so incredibly awesome. Yesterday, I was feeling quite helpless and just in a lot of emotional turmoil because of everything that's happening in the US right now. The murder of George Floyd, you know, the pandemic, our president and such like that. And I was just feeling so helpless. And I think my biggest takeaway today is not to underestimate the small little acts that I do and the impact that they can have. I feel very tearful right now because that feels so less helpless. And I feel like that just feels so important. So that's my takeaway and my